My name is Ela Jarvis. I'm going to talk to you about my Berkeley Cityscape series, which is currently up at the Albany Community Center in Albany, California until September 5th. I'm going to talk a little bit about my background, and then I'm going to go straight into my work and talk a little bit about my painting process. So first of all, yes, I am born and raised in Berkeley. My mom, who's in the middle, was a total Berkeley bohemian. Here's your dear friend Rebecca Mayeno, who was my kindergarten teacher. Here's Bill Skelton, who my dad's best friend. Both of these guys had families with kids about my age, and everyone loved and worshipped art, and they loved beer, clearly. And, you can see the stereotypical Berkeley house with the creative painting around the doors with the rainbows and all. So, yeah, that's my background. And here's my grandmother, my mother's mother, Elizabeth Peterson, who was a wonderful painter and a watercolorist. And we had a very good, close relationship. And she taught me how to paint. She let me watch her paint, and she taught me a lot. This is a painting that she did of fish that my grandfather taught. They used to like to go on excursions where she would paint and he would fish. And she would take Amtrak train from Lincoln, Nebraska to Berkeley, California, and she'd do these little tiny quick pictures. And sometimes she would sell enough pictures to pay for her train ticket. So that's pretty cool. But you can see she really has great technique. She has an underpainting. This sort of pale part here was done first, and then she let it dry, and then she did this darker part later, and you will see soon other examples in which I use the same technique in my work. I was also very influenced by children's illustrations, particularly Alice in Wonderland. So I love pen work. I love this cross-hatching and outlines. And I was obsessed. I had a leather-bound copy of this book. And when we would go out to the park with our dog, I would try and stick my foot down rabbit holes because I wanted to be Alice in Wonderland so bad. So here's a first example of an underpainting. This is just the first layer for the Claremont Hotel here. And what I find is that my students want desperately to make their pictures look good from the very, very beginning. They don't understand that you have to build layers and eventually get to the point where your picture looks like this. Doesn't look like this immediately. You got to go here first before you can go here. So I painted that yellow all over the place because I wanted this to have kind of a warm autumnal late afternoon feeling to this scene. And you can see where I put these deep blue shadows, which really make it feel like it's late summer. Here is another example of layers and starting off with these smaller shapes. And the speckly color is due to salt. So while the paint is still wet, you sprinkle just the tiniest bit of salt on the wet paint. The salt pushes away the paint and creates this cool texture. And here's the finished picture. And you'll also notice that I have something called atmospheric perspective going on. These signs here are the closest objects, right? And so they're the brightest, whereas the hills are far away. So I've made them much more pale, and that creates that sense of atmosphere and distance. Here's the photo that this next painting is based on. Here's the underpainting. Sometimes underpaintings don't look good. The more you paint, the more you learn how to work with things. So I used a very, very granulating paint with the sky. This is Primatech by Daniel Smith. Mayan blue and some other colors. Wasn't thrilled with how this looked, but I knew that I could work with it. And I'm going to show you how I did it. I layered phthalo blue and quinacridone rose to create a more smoother, more staining layer. And I think combining the two layers, the granulating and the staining layer, actually create a more interesting effect than if I had done just any one by itself. So this is the beauty of happy accidents. Sometimes things don't work out the way you thought they were going to, but you end up with something more complex, more interesting than if it followed along with your original plan. I also added a little white paint to make the clouds whiter. And I'm beginning to paint a small bit at a time, starting with the green patches in the hills, letting them dry before I add the next bit. So here it is. Now I put in this dark green, letting that first layer dry, and then I have a little bit of wet into wet. You can see there's pale parts and intense parts in these trees, that kind of reddish color. So just keep adding more as each layer dries. And you can really see how I've added white up here. It's really popping here with the white. And I've put in all the shadows. It's done. It looks good. It's all right. And any of that blotchiness over here, just that grittiness is not distracting. It works for this picture. So I'm going to talk about the paintings that are in the exhibit. They're going to be a bit more emotionally intense than the other ones that I've shown you so far. This is the dog food factory near 7th Street in West Berkeley. And yeah, I had fun with this picture. It's spooky. What is this building? And I made a point of making the clouds foreboding. I used Payne's gray and zinc white to get that sort of opaque, heavy quality. And the lines in the street were originally white, so I decided to make them yellow, both because yellow is sort of a universal sign for warning, and it's more visually interesting. These are BART tracks over Gilman. This was done plein air, which means I had my paint set up there. I'm standing underneath here while I painted it, looking at it, painting it from life. And I did an underpainting of this sort of pale beige color, let it dry completely, and then I painted this shadowy gray color on top. And you can see here where that underpainting is still showing through. And there's those brush strokes that I did in gray on top. This is the Ashby Underpass. So this is kind of the south end of Aquatic Park. You can kind of lean over and see down in here. And whenever there's heavy rains, it floods down here. I used some samples of Daniel Smith paint, and it's very sparkly and kind of pretty. Gritty and pretty when you see it in person. Here's an old City Hall. I think I used a really smooth paper for this one. But you can see the influence of Alice in Wonderland with all that line work that I did in there. Here's Milvia. This is just a couple blocks away, kind of close to Berkeley High, maybe a little bit block south of Berkeley High. And this building's been yellow forever. Just all these old mid-century and older buildings, which, we'll see how long they are around. I always think of these giant king palm trees as being just iconically Berkeley. And this is another building, which may or may not be around for much longer. We will see. I love how wacky it's been painted. Originally, this whole building was white, and there was a pet food store down here and like a karate studio dojo over here. And I have the contrast of this new building. This is a senior retirement home. It's very, very expensive. It's not very full just because it's so ridiculously expensive. Here's Broadway Terrace. This is just up the block from the California College of Arts and Crafts campus in Oakland, which is no longer. It's now all in San Francisco. But I remember walking past this entrance up this very bougie street, and these pillars were always both kind of romantic and also sort of daunting. It never felt like this is an area that I should go up. And to kind of further drive home that feeling, I added some extra red zones. Don't come up here. Don't stop here. Since I've had the show, I've had a couple people who actually have lived up there or found out that an old teacher of mine actually lived up there. So that makes it feel a little bit better. But, I'm expressing the feeling I had when I did the picture. This is the other end of the spectrum. This is Cedar and 4th Street. Some very rundown, but also iconic buildings. And I used some charcoal to kind of get these dark, heavy black lines and some of the more gritty texture. This is the image that I used in the postcard and on the cover of the catalog for this show, which is available on my website. And this is Addison Street, the very tippy top of Addison Street, and looking down onto Shattuck Avenue. And the information got more and more dense, all the buildings, it just got more and more complicated trying to draw all that information. So instead I decided to just express the feeling of what it's like to be downtown. There's been so much construction downtown, you couldn't walk down the street around the time that I did it. So I decided to just show that, and I used some hematite paint down here and some more samples from Daniel Smith, just kind of showing everything going on. So this is some of the magical realism, of which you'll see more of. Here's some more magical realism. The trees reaching out. I think about how we're losing the sky as we get these more and more tall apartments. We can't see the sky anymore, and how it's going to be hard on the trees. And even this little stop sign is pointing to the left. It's like, let's get out of here. And here's the California College of Arts and Crafts. I took this photo the last time I visited there, knowing that I would never get to see it again. And I wanted to have some of that eerie feeling, so I used a color called Opera Pink, which is very brilliant, and I mixed it with Phthalo Blue because I knew that it would give it kind of a surreal feeling. They're both rather unnatural colors. I'm going to read the text at the top of this picture for you. I was able to attend CCAC because it was on the 51 bus line. I could live at home in West Berkeley, hop on the bus, and ride it to my college in Oakland. It was a beautiful campus, and it was the first time I really belonged. I learned so much, and 28 years later, I still owe $12,000 in debt. Here's the second one, and I dropped a little bit of water on this picture, and it lifted the paint, and I thought it looked cool, so I tried to repeat that process throughout the picture, and in the areas where I couldn't make that happen, I actually used a little bit of white paint and a little bit of blue paint, and just decided to kind of let it get into that magical realism again. It's like, what are these ghostly shapes? What do they mean? So this one says, people don't understand what is valuable anymore. It's only worth what it can buy. If you destroy a place or a thing, you are left with nothing. This is a quote from my mom when I told her that they were going to build apartments on the former CCAC campus. And that was from May 18th, 2023. More experiments. This is what happens when I use a linocut print that I made, and I painted gouache onto the block, and I printed onto paper. And then I had some fun and did some extra splatters and whatnot, but it worked, and that made me think, gee, I should do this with some of my other pictures. So here's a picture where I did it. These are suns. These are linocuts, and I printed with gold gouache paint, and I then proceeded to add more coloring in between those gold lines with blue and other colors and having fun with it. And this is San Pablo and Barrett in Richmond, not too far from where I teach at the Richmond Art Center. And I really like this picture. Got some wet into wet technique down here. Here is Goodbye Ococole. Everyone's sad that they tore this cafe down. It's gone. And it happened during COVID, and this particular greenish shape kind of reminded me of a virus. So I put that in there. And it's sort of like the ghostly cafe, and then also the construction site at the same time. And this $sign and these wings are two separate linocuts that I put on there. Yeah, I started playing with bubbles, mixing watercolor paint with dish soap and water, and blowing into the bowl of soap and paint, getting these bubbles, and then dipping the paper into the bubble mixture. And I have a greenish blue color here, and I also had another container with Payne's Gray over here. So I've got two dips on this one page. And I'll show you some examples of how I used it. So this is the first step in a painting called Do You Think You Can Tell? I kept thinking of Wish You Were Here by Pink Floyd as I worked on this picture, and kind of being sold a cheap facade with all of these apartment buildings that look very impressive. And they're very expensive, and they have very fancy names. But what are they really? Are they actually an improvement? So here's the finished picture. You can see I've added more construction going on the background over here, having fun with the $signs and the wings. And I like the contrast of the orange construction, cones and barriers and yellow lines in the street, and just, adding some other color that gets your attention and pulls your eye down. So there's that picture. I like that one a lot. Here I am doing it again with another one. This is the first step with just the bubbles and getting the cranes in there, and then adding all the other layers. I did a lot more, and I have a lot of questions like, who lives here? Where are we? Why? When did it start? Just, trying to understand what the hell's going on. And the contrast of what the windows reflect, and then what's actually in the sky. What is real? What is not real? Here is the hottest day. More bubbles. There are bubbles in the background. This is a very large piece. This is 20 by 24 inches, I believe, and had some black paint that I let drip. I turned it upside down and let the drips happen, and did a whole rainbow of colors on top of those bubbles. This is gold paint on the crane. I rubbed some yellow chalk pastel here, and this is silver paint in the middle. And these more fantastical pictures, they're both commentary, and they're about what's going on in the world, and also they're more interesting. I don't know what I'm going to do next. I get to make it up as I go. So they're also more exciting to paint. This is a big masking fluid splatter. And once that masking fluid dried, then I poured a bunch of blue paint, this color right here, on top. Put some masking fluid on top, so that saved the blue area. And then I have this black ink that I poured on as a last layer. And then I removed the masking fluid, and you see these other layers coming through. So it's kind of cool looking. And I wanted to apply that to a painting, so I did. So I painted the sky red, poured the masking fluid here, so that saved all the red area. Then I painted blue-gray gouache on top, which is opaque. And then, I had masked off this crane right here to protect it. Then I poured this black ink and dripped it around last. And then I removed the masking fluid. But this is the result. So I took big risks with this picture. I basically painted all these buildings and did all those effects and just said, whatever happens, happens. And I think it's really cool. It kind of reminds me of anime. And this next one is my most depressing. So this is down near 4th Street. And there's the old former Spanger's parking lot, Albany shell mound. In the background, we have those apartment buildings that we see everywhere. And they have for lease signs on them, because they do. They always have for lease signs on them, in spite of the fact that there's supposed to be a housing crisis. The fact that we have these empty apartment buildings, it's very strange. And there are people here who cannot afford to live in those buildings. It's frustrating. As the rent prices go up, more and more people are being unhoused. And yet the rents don't go down. Don't like to get too heavy with it, except in this picture I clearly am going all the way. In terms of experiments, I was really interested in this dark red color. This is a cadmium red deep. And I was thinking, how can I work that into a picture? And I thought a sunset, a really foreboding sunset, would work. So that's what I did. And by the way, people often ask me what paintings mean or what various symbols mean in my pictures. And my answer is always going to be, what do you think it means? And pretty much whatever they say, it's like, okay, you asked me that question because you wanted to verify that feeling, that symbol that you picked up on. It's probably true. And, you have permission to interpret any of this any way you want to. If I could say everything in words, I wouldn't have needed to paint it. This is the last picture in the series. This is Shell Mound. And, the iconic train tracks. I had fun using a panoramic lens with my camera, getting that distortion over here off to the side. And here's that shell mound behind a fence. And here's those same apartment buildings in the background. And all of this work is about impermanence and just thinking about how old is the Bay Area, how much things have changed. There used to be a 30-foot high mound here, and it was 300 feet long, and it's been traced as far back as 3,700 BCE. So that's older than Stonehenge. And around 1900, the settlers tore it down. They took it down to build streets. It was an ancient monument. Well, it wasn't just a monument. It was something that it was a religious site where they had ceremonies and bodies were buried. And thankfully now one particular area has been reclaimed to the Ohlone people. They can now have a memorial center there. That's the plan that I've heard last. Here I am talking about the frustration of all these places that are disappearing and looking at who was here first, how we really are just a speck in the history of this land here. I had a lot of fun pouring paint onto the sky and spraying it with water and letting it drip and putting copper paint in these drips up here. I've really enjoyed painting this series, and I intend to continue with it. And if you would like to follow my progress, I encourage you to get on my website, subscribe for my monthly newsletter, and I will share photos of current projects and also upcoming classes at the Richmond Art Center where I teach, and also independent classes that I teach on my own. You can also see what I'm up to on Instagram, and I have a lot of instructional videos for watercolor on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for watching. Take care.